Welcome to Murder Road Trip. I'm Haley.
And I'm Jess.
We will be snacking on Georgia peaches and Memphis barbecue ribs as we travel from Atlanta, Georgia to Memphis, Tennessee to discuss the life and assassination of Martin Luther King Jr.
Every third Monday in the month of January, Americans celebrate the birth, life, and accomplishments of Martin Luther King Jr. We thought it was only fitting to tell Martin Luther King Jr.'s story on this day. However, due to copyright laws, we will not be reading or playing any of his speeches. Instead, we will post links to each speech.
Are you ready to go?
I am.
We lost the station again.
Keep trying.
I'm safe.
Hold on. Let me try this one.
Stop. That's it.
Turn it up. Martin Luther King Jr. was born Michael King Jr. on the 15th of January, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia. He was the second child and first son of Michael King Sr. and Alberta Williams King. He grew up in the religious King household with his older sister Christine and younger brother Alfred Daniel, who went by the nickname A.D. The family was heavily involved in their church, and Michael was a member of the choir. When Michael King Jr. was a young boy, he accompanied his father on a trip to Germany. Upon their return home, his father changed both of their names from Michael to Martin Luther in honor of the German religious former whom they had learned about on their trip. Martin Luther King Jr. grew up in the South in a time of much racism and segregation. His first memory of segregation was being forced to attend a different school than his friend, who was white. At that time, there was no other option and all schools were segregated by color. His early schooling was rather uneventful in comparison with the rest of his life.
At 15, Martin Luther King Jr. graduated from Booker T. Washington High School. In September of 1944, following in his father's footsteps, Martin began his college education at Morehouse College in Atlanta. At Morehouse, Martin was heavily involved in extracurricular activities, such as the debate team and the student council. During his time at the college, he became more and more aware of political issues. After his sophomore year, he wrote a letter to the editor of Atlanta's largest newspaper. He explained his position, as a man of color in a segregated nation. He clarified issues down to their roots, that African American people wanted to be treated with respect and dignity, and to be allowed to live their lives. He explained the basic human rights, such as voting, that were missing from the lives of all African Americans, and how giving these rights would not cause any issues for the people who were so afraid of change. This letter was Martin's first political stand, and a sign of the stands that he would take throughout his life.
Throughout his education, Martin maintained a strong link to his faith and decided that he was being called to work in the church. In February of 1948, he was ordained and became the assistant pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. In August of the same year, Martin graduated from Morehouse with a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology. The following month, he started studying at the Crozer Theological Seminar in Chester, Pennsylvania, and graduated in May of 1951 with a Bachelor in Divinity. Martin was the valedictorian, and as such, he gave a speech at the graduation, but Martin wasn't finished with his studies. In September of 1951, he began studying systematic theology at Boston University, and in June of 1955, he was awarded a doctorate.
While Dr. King was studying in Boston, he met Coretta Scott through a mutual friend. The pair married on the 18th of June in 1953 in Marion, Alabama, just 18 months after they first met. Together they had 4 children. Their first child, Yolanda Denise, was born in November of 1955. Martin III was born in 1957, and another son, Dexter Scott, arrived in 1961. Their family was completed by the arrival of Bernice Albertine in 1963.
Martin Luther King Jr. became involved in peaceful protests through his involvement in the Birmingham African American Committee. One of his earlier and most notable protests was the Montgomery bus boycott. It began in March of 1955 when Claudette Colvin, a 15-year-old young woman of color, refused to give up her seat to a white man while riding the bus. Because Claudette was young, pregnant, and unmarried, the Birmingham African American Committee refused to intervene.
9 months later, on the 1st of December 1955, Rosa Parks famously refused to give up her seat and moved to the back of the bus when she was on her way home from work. This peaceful protest resulted in her arrest and gained attention when Martin Luther King Jr. called for everyone to boycott the buses for one day. With King at the helm, the protest lasted over 380 days. During the Montgomery bus boycott, there were several threats made to Dr. King's safety and the safety of his family. These threats included a threatening phone call and a bombing at his home. Dr. King was not at home at the time of the bombing, and thankfully his family was unharmed.
The bus boycott ended on the 13th of November in 1956 when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional. A little over a month later, city bus segregation was eliminated, and Dr. King was one of the first people to ride an integrated bus.
In January of 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. became the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The SCLC was a group of Southern black ministers whose objective was to fight segregation. The following month, Dr. King was on the cover of Time magazine. By May, he was holding his first national address at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., where he delivered his speech entitled "Give Us the Ballot." In June of 1957, Dr. King met with then Vice President Richard Nixon. During the meeting, King urged Nixon to visit the South to show his support for civil rights, and to also pass a civil rights bill.
In 1958, Dr. King published his first book entitled Stride Towards Freedom, The Montgomery Story. In September of 1958, while at a book signing, a 42-year-old woman stabbed Dr. King with a letter opener in the upper left side of his chest. He was rushed to Harlem Hospital where the letter opener was removed and Dr. King recovered from surgery. Due to the location of where Dr. King was stabbed, it is said that if he had even sneezed, he would have died. The woman, Isola Ware Curry, underwent observations at Bellevue Hospital where she was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. She was found not competent to stand trial and was instead committed to Matewan State Hospital for the criminally insane.
Never in one place for long, Dr. King and his family relocated to Atlanta, Georgia in February of 1960, so that Dr. King could spend more time working for the SCLC. He was passionate about devoting as much time as possible to the freedom struggle. While in Atlanta, Dr. King once again became the assistant pastor at the Ebenezer Baptist Church.
The following year, in 1961, Dr. King met with the new president, John F. Kennedy. The focus of their meeting was a second Emancipation Proclamation to end segregation entirely. The two stayed in contact about this and other issues until the president's death in 1963. During this time, Dr. King was involved with organizing the Albany Movement, which was a peaceful march to protest segregation. Thousands turned out for the march. Other peaceful protests were attended by Dr. King, and over the next 2 years he would be arrested at protests multiple times, and even assaulted by a member of the American Nazi Party while at a conference in Alabama. During one prison stay, Dr. King penned the letter from Birmingham Jail, which later became famous for its message.
In 1963, the U.S. Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, gave the FBI permission to wiretap Dr. King's home. The FBI wanted to tap Dr. King's home for many reasons, including suspicions that communists were infiltrating the SCLC, but mainly the FBI saw Dr. King as a threat. He was an effective civil rights leader, and this worried the FBI. They wanted to do whatever they could to make him a less effective leader, and tapping his home would give them the heads up about his future plans and goings-on.
While the King's home was being tapped, Dr. King began plans for the Birmingham campaign. The campaign was spearheaded by the SCLC, and it was specifically protesting the segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. SCLC members took part in marches and sit-ins in public spaces where people of color weren't welcome. The intent of the campaign was to make the protesters impossible to ignore so that lawmakers might finally start negotiating with the SCLC. However, this didn't end up working. There wasn't enough media attention to get the lawmakers interested. So, the SCLC changed tact. They asked their members to bring their children to join the protest, figuring that children at sit-ins would cause more of a stir. The Birmingham police responded to the peaceful protesters with violence. High-pressure water jets and police dogs were set on all protesters, regardless of their age. Unfortunately, it took violence to get the media's attention. The protest and the police response became national news. However, it worked. Jim Crow signs were removed from the city, and public places began to be more inclusive of Black people. It was a start.
The biggest and most well-known protest organised by Dr. King was the March on Washington. The march was in aid of jobs and freedom. It was held in Washington, D.C. on the 28th of August 1963. More than 200,000 people packed into the area outside the Lincoln Memorial. This is where 200,000 people watched Martin Luther King Jr. deliver his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, a speech that is still quoted today. After the march, Dr. King, along with the other civil rights leaders, met President John F. Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson in the White House.
After the March on Washington, Dr. King was named Man of the Year by Time magazine. He also became the youngest person, at the time, to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Dr. King was becoming very popular. However, he still had the FBI against him. Dr. King criticized the FBI's failure to protect civil rights workers. This led the agency's director, J. Edgar Hoover, to accuse Dr. King of being a liar, and to accuse the SCLC of being led by communists and people of poor moral standing.
The next big protest that Dr. King was involved with was the Selma voting right movement. The first attempt at this was held on the 7th of March 1965, and is known as Bloody Sunday after voting rights marchers were beaten at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. Dr. King wasn't present at this march because of church duties, although it was attended by other members of the SCLC. The police brutality shown at this event was captured by the media, and it was broadcasted nationwide. The brutality shown at the first protest did not deter the movement. From the 17th to the 25th of March, Dr. King, along with other civil rights leaders, led marches from Selma to Montgomery. They met on the steps of the state capitol, and Dr. King delivered his "How Long, Not Long" speech.
In late March of 1968, Dr. King traveled to Memphis, Tennessee to lead a march in support of sanitation workers who were striking. The workers were striking due to low wages and poor treatment. The march consisted of 6,000 people. Unfortunately, the march turned violent and people started looting. Dr. King was rushed from the protest and taken to safety. On the 3rd of April, Dr. King returned to Memphis to lead another march. He was delayed due to a bomb threat on his plane. However, he was able to arrive safely. He was determined to make this April 4th march a peaceful one. During the evening's rally, Dr. King gave his final speech, "I've been to the mountaintop."
After the rally, Dr. King went to the Lorraine Motel, where he was staying in room 206. Just before 6 p.m, he stepped out onto his room's balcony to talk to some SCLC members who were in the parking lot below. At 6:01 p.m, a shot rang out, and Martin Luther King Jr. collapsed to the ground. He was rushed to the nearby St. Joseph's Hospital, where he was taken into emergency surgery. It was found that a bullet had entered his chin and had gone down his spinal cord. Unfortunately, there was nothing the doctors could do, and Martin Luther King Jr. died at 7:05 p.m.
News of Dr. King's death sparked race riots all over the United States. President Lyndon B. Johnson declared the 7th of April to be a national day of mourning.
On the 8th of April, Mrs. Coretta King and her children went to Memphis to lead the next sanitation worker march that Dr. King had planned on leading that day. I don't know about you, Hayley, but I'm amazed at that. She was one very strong lady. The next day, Coretta and her children returned to Atlanta to say a final farewell to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Coretta and her children continued Dr. King's work. Coretta became a prominent women's rights activist and was also involved in fighting for LGBTQ rights. All of the King children also became activists.
Police launched an investigation into the murder of Dr. King. They quickly figured out that the shot came from a nearby apartment. In the apartment, the police found a set of fingerprints on several items. The fingerprints matched a man, James Earl Ray.
James Earl Ray was born on the 10th of March, 1928, in Elton, Illinois, to Lucille and George Ray. His family moved to Bowling Green, Missouri in 1930, and then to Ewing, Missouri in 1935. Ray left school at 15, and at 16 he moved back to Elton to live with his grandmother. He joined the army at the end of World War II and served in Germany. He was charged with drunkenness and was dishonorably discharged in December of 1948. After his discharge, he returned to Elton to live with his grandmother again.
In 1949, Ray was in California when he was arrested for robbing a restaurant and was sentenced to 90 days in jail. This was the start of a life of crime. He served 4 years in the United States Penitentiary Leavenworth for robbing a post office of 66 money orders. He was then sentenced to 10 years in Missouri State Penitentiary for repeated offenses including armed robbery, burglary, and multiple failed escape attempts.
However, on the 23rd of April 1967, Ray made a successful escape from prison by hiding in a bread truck. After his escape, he travelled around the US. On the 24th of March 1968, he drove to Atlanta and bought a map of the city. He was there to murder Martin Luther King Jr. Ray started tracking Dr. King and went to his church, but he wasn't there. After this, Ray drove to Birmingham and bought a rifle, scope, and ammunition. He then drove back to Atlanta, where he read in a paper that Martin Luther King would be in Memphis on the first day of April. He drove to Memphis and made his final plans. He got a room at a rooming house very close to where Dr. King was staying, and he waited. When he took the fatal shot, Ray was standing in a bathtub in a second-story bathroom.
After killing Dr. King, Ray fled the room and drove back to Atlanta. He collected his things and fled to Canada, where he stayed for over a month. In that month, he acquired a fake Canadian passport and flew to England. What he did in England is unknown. When he tried to leave the UK on the 8th of June in 1968, he was arrested for trying to leave the UK on a fake passport. At this point, he was a wanted man in the United States. The following month, Ray was extradited to Tennessee and was charged with Dr. King's murder. Upon arriving back in the States, Ray confessed to the crime. However, he recanted 3 days later and said that he was being framed by a gun smuggler named Raul. He changed his story yet again, but eventually pled guilty to the murder in court. He was sentenced to 99 years in prison. But Ray had a history of escape, and this time was no different from the others. He escaped prison on the 11th of November in 1977 with 7 other inmates. Only 2 days later, he was captured and returned to the prison, where another 100 years were added to his sentence. There were allegations of a conspiracy that described Ray as a scapegoat in the Dr. King murder. Allegations were made that Ray only confessed to take the death penalty off the table. There were also witnesses that said that the fatal shot came from a different area, in the shrubbery near the apartment, not the apartment window.
In 1976, Ray's case came before the House Select Committee on Assassinations. They looked over the evidence that was collected and used against Ray in Dr. King's assassination. They found that Ray may have had co-conspirators, but there was no evidence that the government was involved at all.
Dr. King's son, Dexter, was in favor of Ray getting a new trial, and he believed that the first trial was not just. Dexter met with Ray in 1997 in an effort to support getting a new trial. However, there was no new trial, as Ray died on the 23rd of April in 1998 in prison from kidney and liver failure.
Martin Luther King Jr. left a legacy when he died. He was responsible for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which states that it is illegal to discriminate against African Americans, or any minority for that matter, in education, public areas, and employment. He was also responsible for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which removed barriers for African American voters.
In 1983, President Ronald Reagan signed a bill which made the third Monday of every January, a day near Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, a federal holiday. The first Martin Luther King Jr. Day was observed in 1986. He is the only non-president to have a national holiday dedicated to him. This is Kelly W. describing how Dr. King affected her life.
And I'm sharing my story about how Martin Luther King Jr. had an effect on my life. I grew up in a really small town in Illinois, and mostly everybody is white. And my mom is Mexican. She moved to Illinois with her family when she was 13 years old, and she did experience forms of discrimination, racial prejudice when she came here, speaking no English at all. And she'd always just been a fan of Martin Luther King Jr. in general. She's also always been very proud of her U.S. citizenship. And she's a teacher. She's retired now, but growing up, she was always teaching lessons. Even when we were not at school, we'd come home and there were always lessons to be learned. So I remember when we were growing up, my sister and I, my mom would always watch his speech every year on his birthday. And when we'd be home and wanting to play with friends, you know, when you're young and you don't care what day it is, you're just happy to have the day off from school. So, she always admired him. And, I remember one year in particular, my sister and I were sitting around bouncing on the couch and we were supposed to be watching the speech. And my mom was standing kind of in front of us because she was just very enthralled with his speech. And so she was standing somewhat close to the TV and we were sort of behind her, sitting on the couch, giggling, bouncing around, pretending to be watching, but we weren't really. We just wanted to go play. I'm guessing I was probably in about third or fourth grade. And my mom trying to listen to the speech, I could tell she was upset with us, giggling and all that. And she said to us pretty sternly, she's like, "You better be quiet and listen or I'm going to make you write a paper." And we were like, "Oh, we don't want to do that." But we continued giggling and just not paying attention. And then that tone when your mom gets really mad and when you're definitely in trouble. A few seconds later, she was like, "That's it. Get some paper and a pencil, and I want you to write down and tell me what this speech means to you." And she was really mad. I remember my sister and I looked at each other in shock because we didn't know what we were going to write about. We weren't paying attention. And it was definitely a very good lesson for us to learn. So we sat down, we wrote our papers, and we had to discuss it with our mom. And it was a very meaningful conversation, especially in a town where everybody's white, or mostly everybody is white, and race is not discussed, or at that time it wasn't discussed. And it was a very good lesson for my sister and I to learn, because I don't know when we would have realized what his speech was all about and what he stood for. I don't know when we would have realized that, because we certainly didn't discuss it at school. And I remember the next year after that, when his speech came on TV, I remember her giving us fair warning: if you don't listen, you're going to have to write a paper. And we knew that she definitely meant it. And then last summer, when the riot in Charlottesville happened, I was pretty upset, and I was glued to the news, and it felt surreal. It's like I couldn't believe it was happening, but I know these things are still, unfortunately, part of American life in many cities, and it's very sad to say the least. But I wanted to talk to my mom because I knew she always had some insight, especially relating to Martin Luther King Jr. And I asked her if she thought that what had happened was scarier or more intense now, or if all of the protesting and the riots and all of the civil rights the parts of the civil rights movement that were happening in the 60s, if it was scarier back then. And she said, without hesitation, she said, oh, it's definitely a lot scarier now because we don't have anybody like Martin Luther King Jr. to give us hope. And I've thought about it so many times, and she's right. There's definitely nobody that compares to him. And I only wish I had been alive to maybe be able to carry more meaning along with that. I can't claim to know how hard it is for people who are still judged by the color of their skin and not the content of their character. But it certainly hurts my heart to know that it happened. So I'm just grateful that my mom took the time to teach me that lesson.
Thank you, Kelly, for sharing your story with us. This is Jeff R. describing how Dr. King affected his life.
Hello, I'm Jeff Richardson from the podcasts Everything is Awesome with Jeff and KC and Shattered Worlds RPG. I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about one of my great heroes, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Definitely one of the members of my fantasy dinner party. Let's see. I guess the first time I took notice of Dr. King was sometime in elementary school. You know, he's one of the guys they teach you about pretty much right away. And at that time, all I knew about black people was pretty much Dr. King, Bill Cosby, Michael Jackson, although I wasn't even, I'm not even sure if I knew he was the, a black person at the time. And then an immigrant that stayed with us for a while from Cuba named Felix, and he was a really cool guy, really sweet guy. But anyway, growing up in the suburbs, Gig Harbor, Washington, I called it Whitey Town. We didn't have a lot of exposure. Let's just put it that way. And so Dr. King was sort of the first ambassador, if you like, from black culture to my life. And I mean, if you're gonna pick one example, he's a pretty good one, right? I mean, obviously, he's a human being. Everybody has certain things about them that aren't perfect, and the FBI tried to make as much as they could out of that stuff. But, everything we read about in the history books is real. He believed in God and all that stuff, and it motivated him to do good works. And those good works involved making our country better. We talk about founding fathers, Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and those guys were great, in many ways. And Dr. King should definitely be considered when we talk about that concept and teach about it. I saw Gandhi, I think, is when I really started to think I might want to be like Dr. King. I saw Gandhi, 6-hour movie. He led this peaceful revolt to get their own country. And when I read somewhere that Dr. King modeled his program of nonviolent passive resistance on Gandhi's work, I was like, oh man, there's really something happening here. Like it's not just a tactic, maybe it's a way of life. And over time, I learned more about Dr. King. I got involved in the peace movement during the Iraq War. There was a time where I was really struggling with some family stuff. Some trauma was coming up, and I was looking for some truth. And I found a Quaker meeting. And when I went to the Quaker meeting, once again, I saw the kind of way of life that embodies peace and nonviolent resistance. And, it just reminded me again, like here is another thing about King that sticks with me, is that he wasn't just a guy calling for peace. He wasn't just a guy calling for an end to segregation. He was a guy that wanted a better world and saw in his heart that it could be done. That you meet people that say we'll always have war. Economy gets better when there's a war. that things are always going to be this way. And Dr. King, just like Mother Teresa and just like a bunch of other people, George Fox, as Quakers go, and I'm sure I could rattle off a long list. He was one of those people that just saw what could be and decided to go for it. And with all the police brutality stuff and black folks trying to rally and better their situations, as an ally, I catch wind of some of the conversations that happen, and every once in a while people will talk about getting violent, going more in the carrying guns kind of Black Panther style thing, and saying that that's always been necessary to improve society. And maybe they're right. I don't know. I mean, I'm a letter carrier. I'm in the labor movement, and the labor movement has a long history of armed conflict with strikebreakers and the Pinkertons and the American Legion, and basically paid goons. And a lot of us felt in the past that swinging a club, was part of what you do to make a union work. And if the right to strike was threatened in my area, in our country, like I might be nudged in that direction. But my heroes are Gandhi and King, and I don't know. I don't think I would ever go that route. And because peace, the belief that is possible, is so radical, it's hard for people to understand that you can win it through not fighting. Dr. King showed us that it's possible. But here's the thing. I think why a lot of people go the more violent route is because they don't want to sit down and be hurt. And if you've ever had a difficult problem in your relationship, if you've ever had a crappy family, you understand that getting hurt is a part of life. If you're going to throw punches, well, maybe you wouldn't get hurt that day, but sooner or later it's going to come back around. Throwing punches doesn't keep you from being emotionally hurt. And the things King was fighting against, segregation, poor schools, bad nutrition, like all the ways that black people get pushed down and don't get a leg up, those things took getting hurt, getting physically hurt, getting shamed, and it sucks, but guess what? Over time, as King says, the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. And that's not just a slogan. That is a philosophy that undergirds everything I do, whether it's the labor movement or peace or art, just interacting with people on a daily basis. Dr. King, there's a reason why if I ever get a tattoo, he's going to be the first one on my arm. Like, he feels like a brother to me. He feels like family. And, he's one of the main reasons why I hope there's a heaven, because I just want to grab him in my arms and hold him and thank him for everything he did. And, he said in that Memphis church the night before he died, he had a prophecy, and it was, I might not get there with you, but I have seen the promised land. And, a racist guy probably tied with the mob and the CIA killed him. Government covered it up, and it sucks. A lot of people rioted, but you know what? His mission lived on, his message lived on, and a whole lot of people, white, black, and everyone else, owe a debt of gratitude to the man. I hope we never forget his story, his life, and his legacy. Thank you so much for telling his story.
Thank you, Jeff, from the Everything is Awesome with Jeff and KC and the Shattered Worlds podcast, for sharing your story with us. This is Cesare Gray describing how Dr. King affected his life.
what Martin Luther King means to me. Growing up African American in an African American family, we learned about Martin Luther King at a very young age. My parents told me how Martin Luther King paved the way for African Americans and other minorities to be on an equal playing field with white Americans throughout the United States. Growing up, I began to understand more and more how important his pursuit to create equality for all really meant. And today, I stand firm in my belief that we were all created equal and have equal rights.
Thank you, Cesare, for sharing your story with us.
If you didn't already know, you can also listen to Hayley on the We're All Just Pretending podcast, where she gives bad advice, on purpose. You can also hear me on this week's episode when I subbed for Hayley.
You can also find Jess and me on the Playlist podcast. Playlist is a podcast where Josh Hallmark of Our Americana and the Karen and Ellen Letters has different podcasters on to talk about their favorite songs. Every podcast has a different theme and a new panel of podcasters.
You can find Murder Road Trip at murderroadtrip.com, on Instagram and Twitter at murdertrip, and on Facebook at Murder Road Trip Podcast. If you're interested in continuing the discussion, you can join the Murder Road Trip podcast group on Facebook.
Make sure to check out the Murder Road Trip playlist on Spotify. You can even add songs to the playlist.
If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe on your podcast app of choice.